Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to call to order this regularly scheduled Intergovernmental Relations Committee meeting. My name is Andrew Johnson. I'm the committee chair, and I'm joined today by a quorum of committee members, Council Members Reich, Councilmember Warsame, Council Vice President and Vice Chair of the committee, Andrew Jenkins, Council President Bender, Councilmember Schrader, and we're also joined by Councilmember Ellison today. Thanks for being a committee. So we have two items on our printed agenda and as well a walk-on item that I want to add to the agenda under consent. That item is related to amending the legislative agenda and policy positions to put support in there for a state statute around catalytic converter thefts, which are really affecting a lot of residents, not just in Minneapolis, but really across the Twin Cities. So I will see if anyone has any questions or concerns about adding that to the agenda. And then what I'm going to do is, since each one of these, we're going to move forward the first printed item without consent. So what I'm going to do is I'll just, to make things really easy and clear for everybody, I'll take this walk-on item and move approval first of amending the legislative agenda. Any further comments, questions? Not seeing any. All those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, the motion carries. And then we have our first item on the printed consent agenda, which is the passage of a resolution for Highway 252 and I-94. I know that there's some interest in having this item a little bit more amending of the language. So I'm not sure if any committee members or our guest council member want to speak to this item, but happy to recognize them. Council Member Reich.
Yes, certainly, Mr. Chair. Yeah, the intention is to dovetail some of the work and language that have been, several offices have shown considerable interest in this, which is appropriate. And we want to make sure that that language dovetails well in the final comment that we want to make as a city. So I'm very committed to the language that we want to have be strong and clear, because the community is definitely watching this, and the impacts of a project might have related impacts that might not be apparent in the base project, but we recognize can have definite impacts in terms of the broader community and our other network, transportation network. So we want to make that clear and not lose this opportunity to make those comments, and we're going to make them as smooth and clear as possible.
Absolutely. Thank you. Council President Bender.
I'm happy to defer to Councilmember Ellison. You want to? Okay.
Councilmember Ellison.
Thank you, Council President. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to make a few comments. One is that, I think there has been a lot of discussion. There's a lot of interest. I know that Councilmember Cunningham, who wasn't able to be here today, this is also something that's probably going to affect his ward the most. But North Minneapolis as a whole, the North Metro as a whole, the project is sort of a spans 3 cities in that way. I think one of the things that has slowly dawned on me as we've been having this conversation about this freeway expansion is I've been asking myself, how is this going to land on North Minneapolis residents? And at first, when you ask the question, well, what do you think of the I-94 252 project? It's sort of like, it's hard to have a response to that, right? I think, but once you kind of put it into the clearest terms possible, I think the real question is, how are Northside residents and Brooklyn Center residents are going to feel about widening 94, which anybody who is familiar with North Minneapolis knows that 94 is viewed, I think correctly by a lot of the residents there, as something that really broke up connectivity from the river and from downtown. And while there's a lot of maybe semantic maneuvering to say, well, we're not doing this, we're doing this, I think once you start seeing those bulldozers go through 90, once residents start seeing those bulldozers excavating hills and adding lanes, no amount of semantic gymnastics is going to convince people that we're not deepening and widening what many people view as a scar that has contributed to the lack of connectivity from North Minneapolis to the river and downtown. And so I think that it's really important, that Minneapolis has a stake in this. The most of the construction is going to happen outside of the city, but everything south of that construction is going to be impacted. And so we wanted to make sure that this project prioritizes racial equity, prioritizes connectivity, and a few other priorities that we feel like the current construction, the current way that the current layout doesn't prioritize those things as much. And again, that's not because anybody has any sort of intent. I think that that's just sort of how these projects go if you allow them to move at the speed of the status quo. And so that's really the intention behind the shift in language. And I'm excited to work with my colleagues to hopefully get something that is that we can all sort of stand proudly on by Friday.
Excellent. Any other comments? Council Vice Chair Jenkins. Oh, all right. Council President Benner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I do want to just also underscore some things that Councilmember Ellison said and highlight that this project is at a really critical point. A lot of decisions are going to be made by agencies, MnDOT, by the Metropolitan Council. Those two agencies are currently working together to scope the environmental review of this project. So it is a moment where I think the city wants to be exceedingly clear in our position. So I'm glad that we're taking the time that we need to say what we really mean to say and incorporate, as Councilmember Reich, as Chair Reich said, all of the various perspectives. As Councilmember Ellison said, I-94 caused harm in our communities. And, we have the benefit as a city of the recent experience of really standing firm on insisting that the 35W corridor has transit in it. We learned a lot from that experience. And I think it is unthinkable that the city of Minneapolis would have a different standard for this corridor than we did for the 35W corridor. In fact, given the history here, I think, there's just many layers of concern that even go beyond the transit piece. So, just being exceedingly clear that the transit piece is non-negotiable for the city of Minneapolis. As Councilmember Ellison said, this is a safety project, and of course we care deeply about everyone's safety and have a commitment to working with our partners in Brooklyn Center and Brooklyn Park to make sure that people are safe. But the widening that is proposed for this roadway, I think there are a lot of questions to ask about that approach to street safety, given all that we know about street design and all that we have learned collectively as a community about, road capacity and safety for all users. So I think there are fundamental questions even about the pieces that aren't in Minneapolis, but certainly the pieces that are not in our city have dramatic impacts on our community. It looks like from the projections of the project sponsors that traffic will almost double in Minneapolis as a result of this project. And that is, a huge impact on communities that are already seeing, the history of environmental injustice, health impacts from the freeway itself and other cumulative health impacts. So when we talk about race equity and health equity in particular, this project just needs to be held to those same standards. And I think we are lucky that we have leadership at MnDOT and at the Metropolitan Council who I know share those values. So it's just a matter of applying those values to this project and making sure that we don't, say yes to something that's going to do harm, that we work collectively together with our neighboring jurisdictions to make sure that, yes, we are improving safety for all users, but we're not doing it at the expense of communities that have seen the impact of this roadway already, that are suffering from disparate health impacts already, that are suffering from being cut off from the river and other destinations that have, disinvestments in transit and other transportation equity investments. So I think, we're getting to a point where we're becoming more clear, I think, expressing the position of the city council, of the city of Minneapolis on this project at a point where it's really important we do that so that we can shape the project going forward. And I think we have a lot of, folks in the community are saying these things already. I know Metropolitan Council is already shifting their work program around to look again at the transit in response to a recent public community event. So I think we're in alignment with a lot of what's already being said by folks in the community. So look forward to working out those final details before Friday. And I'm really thankful for everyone's work on this. I did also want to say, I think that whether it's a formal action or just informal conversations with the city attorney's office and with Public Works, there is some discussion about fragmenting the project off. And I think that's a little cause for alarm for us. Again, seeing so many of the negative potential impacts of widening farther north. I think we're just going to want to be really vigilant in our own advocacy for the city, and really understand what are our legal tools that are available to us, what are the diplomatic tools that are available to us, what are the organizing tools that are available to us, and use them all as we did on the 35W corridor, with lots of lessons to draw from there. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely. Vice Chair Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. Boy, I'm not sure if I can state it more eloquently than Council President Bender, but I will just note that, freeways and freeway expansions have historically decimated African American communities all throughout the country. And, certainly here in the Twin Cities, the Rondo community in St. Paul, South Minneapolis, where I live and represent and work, and having been in Councilmember Lilligren's office as a policy aide, as well as Councilmember Glidden's office as a policy aide, while we fought valiantly for many, many years to stop the destruction of widening the freeway I-35W without any consideration to the communities, the neighborhoods, to transit. I know that we can do it. I know that MnDOT and Metropolitan Council can do it. And we, as a body, have to remain strong and help them to make this a project that is equitable and considerate. I'm not even sure how widening it creates more safety. That seems antithetical to me, but I know it must include mitigation. It must include transit. It must include environmental reviews to understand what those impacts will be. And I think we as the city of Minneapolis have a large role to play in that.
Excellent. Councilmember Ellison.
I want to thank both the Council President and Vice President for those remarks. I think that that's absolutely accurate. One thing that I did also want to name that I think is a concern to our neighbors to the north of us, and while it's not going to maybe affect us and our constituents, is that there are people's homes that are going to be affected by this, right, and potentially destroyed by this project. And I think that shouldn't be taken lightly. And also the fact that, to put it frankly, adding a lane does not resolve congestion issues, right? It resolves congestion issues for maybe months, maybe a single year or two at a time, and then we're right back to where we are with why we're moving forward with this project in the first place, only with more cars on the road, more, So all those things are very accurate, and I think that at some point right now, we're trying to take a project that we think could be better and make sure that it has the values and that it is better. But at some point, I think that we need to start working with St. Paul to talk about getting, really some remedy for these freeways, right? I know they're costed, but we need to start talking about, putting caps on the freeways and, parks above them and all that stuff. So maybe bold visions for a little bit for later, but for right now, I think that we can lean into, race equity and transit and all the things that my colleagues discussed here. But just wanted to say that I think that it's not just Minneapolis who has some pause about this project. I think that some of our neighbors who are also affected also are going to be articulating some pause they have as well in the near future.
Excellent. Any additional discussion? Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to note that, Councilmember Ellison and Cunningham have been involved in this project and I think are showing really great leadership, on behalf of their residents, and just will need our strong support as a body, like standing together with those wards and communities that are directly impacted, knowing that all of us are in this together and that our standards just have to be high. To the council member's point, we hope that we can make this project better, but there may be a point where we say just no to this impact on our community. And those are some tough decisions that I know that council members are under pressure from partner organizations to, be a team player and to think about the safety issues. And those are, of course, things that we want to do, but we can't do that at the expense of the health of our community. So I appreciate their leadership, and I want to say publicly that I know that the city council has their back in whatever positions that we need to take to make sure that this isn't doing harm in the communities in Minneapolis.
Any additional discussion? Just really appreciate all the commentary. I think great comments from colleagues. So the motion is to move this forward without recommendation to the full council. All those in favor, please say aye. Those opposed, the motion carries. With that, we'll move on to our final item, a discussion item receiving a update on our federal, state, and local partners. Mr. Ranieri, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the federal level, there's been an awful, across the world and in our nation, a lot of concern about the coronavirus. And the virus has prompted Congress to spend $8.3 billion a program to help with research, medications, all sorts of medical supplies, also grants to states and local governments to try and combat this virus. Here in Minnesota, on Monday, the legislature passed in both bodies and sent to the governor Chapter 66. What that did is allocated or appropriated $20 million, precisely $20.9 million to the Department of Health and went into the Public Health Response Contingency Account. And that's an account that was set up a couple years ago to deal with emergencies of this type. And that money will be there until February of 2021. It is a one-time appropriation, and it said as of February 1st, 2021, anything over $5 million left in that account goes into the general fund. So the legislature has appropriated approximately $21 million to fight the virus in our state, and it will probably be fought, and there are limitations in the dollars in the contingency account legislation, so there could be some money flowing to our public health department too.
Council Vice President Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Johnson and Mr. Ranieri. Question, do you know, is there a balance in the Public Health Contingency Fund currently prior to the $21 million or the $20.9 million?
Mr. Chairman, Vice President Jenkins, I will check. I think there was, but I'll check. I do not know exactly. We'll get back to you on that.
But the intent is if there's anything over $5 million, that would stay in the account.
Anything over $5 million would go back to the general fund in February of 2021. The $5 million would stay.
$5 million would stay.
So I get the feeling that $5 million may be a floor, but I'll check.
Thank you.
I want to just add some commentary on the coronavirus and the response from a federal level and a state level as well. It's a rapidly evolving situation, and it's great to see that our partners are taking action on this. It's also something that's going to have, a lot of people expect, a very serious impact on our communities. And I think especially and I was just out in Washington, D.C. for the National League of Cities, I'm hearing from restaurant workers, I'm hearing from taxi cab drivers out there about the huge drop-off in terms of customers. And so there's a huge economic component to this, and really some of our lower income residents that are most vulnerable or most sensitive to the changes in the service industry are most at risk of really being hurt by this. And so I think there's a lot of work that can be done on that front. And as well, we need just the federal government to be transparent with us. And it really is harmful when we have the President of the United States out there on Twitter spreading misinformation about this, downplaying the risk and really putting people's lives on the line when he does that. And this is something that is really serious, and we need everyone focused on what has to happen in order to protect public health. And I also want to call out at the same time too, I heard somebody say this, that don't worry. Instead, ask, how serious do I need to take this, and what do I need to do to be prepared? And I think there's a lot of anxiety, and we need to call that out, a lot of anxiety within the community around this. And I just hope people take care of themselves and go to accurate sources for information and are willing to take on what they can in terms of their social responsibility, as well to help keep their neighbors, their friends, their family, their coworkers safe and healthy, and themselves as well. Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I really appreciate those comments that have come on this. And I did want to highlight, well, to your point about the resources, the University of Minnesota has a great website resource where they're sharing information that's geared toward the public, but also, you know, the latest research. And I think it's a really great resource, and we're lucky to have that institution here, and also a great medical provider as well. You know, I got a communication today from someone who works with renters asking if there's anything that we can do around housing stability, knowing that so many people might be financially affected. And I mention it here because I imagine I haven't had a chance to follow up with the city attorney's office or our housing team since I got that message this afternoon. But we know that our powers are limited in the space of renter protections. So it may be something that we look to see if other communities are thinking about this, and whether it's funding for emergency assistance dollars for folks to be able to stay in their housing, or, you know, something more like a moratorium on evictions, or, you know we don't even still have written notification of eviction in Minnesota. So that, you know, our delegation is working on that this session. But is there something that can be done around housing stability as we anticipate folks dealing with incomes dropping and instability, and, you know, childcare instabilities and all those different things? How is that affecting people's ability to stay in their homes? So I thought it was a great point, a great question, and something we may want to raise with our delegation, our partner agencies. The county, which manages millions of dollars in emergency rental assistance. Some of the foundations as well have really stepped up, even in our current situation, which has been challenging and difficult for so many families, knowing that may be ratcheted up. So wanted to mention that here.
Thank you. Any additional discussion on this?
Mr. Chairman, there is an economic impact. It's obvious. Some examples across the country. Austin, Texas, canceled South by Southwest. They're saying it's a $400 million impact on their community. And many of the small businesses rely heavily on Southwest, and some of them may fold because of that. Also, the supply chain, many people like bicycle manufacturers, et cetera, having problems getting materials back from China. Also, we are seeing the Federal Reserve drop the rate again, so there is a concern. And here locally at the state, the governor is looking at what's happening and in terms of projections of revenue, and being very careful about the supplemental budget, which will be coming out shortly if it comes out at all. So it's not only is it a public health issue, it's definitely becoming an economic issue too.
Absolutely.
And also here at the state, there are a couple of things going on with local government aid. The 2021 estimate has been done by the folks in House Research. And for years, we were concerned that we would be exceeding our needs and would stop receiving additional aid and may even have a decline. That year is 2021. Right now, they're projecting possibly a $4.1 million reduction in our local government aid. There are 88 other of our cities in the same position we are in. So we are working with the League of Cities, Metro Cities, to try and find a solution. One of the solutions is that right now, if you had any loss coming in 2020, it was covered. There was a hold harmless that no one could lose in 2020. So we're trying to see if we can find a way to extend that to 2021 and see what that would cost, or is another way to reconfigure the formula where no one loses, but not everyone gains. So we'll keep you posted on that. In the Senate, as you are well aware, there's a bill that would basically tie our LGA expenditures of LGA to the number of police officers we have. There's no similar legislation yet that I'm aware of in the House. Also in pensions, there's an attempt to try and get some more additional funding, basically extend the PER aid program. That was a program that paid so much per person back based on a formula back in 1998. That'd be about $650,000 to the city. We did receive it up till this year, and if it's refunded during this session, we could receive that this year. There's also an attempt in some corridors of legislation that would repeal this year the MRF money, which would be a big hit on the city. The Stadium Reserve bill has been introduced in the Senate to basically keep the money collected in the Stadium Reserve for to write down the bonds in 2023. Similar legislation should be introduced in the House this week.
Great.
I'll stop for questions, Mr. Chairman, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Allison Nessie.
Any questions from committee members? Not seeing any. Thank you. Welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chair Johnson, committee members. My name is Allison Nessie, Government Relations Representative. Yesterday, we had a hearing in the Senate Capital Investment Committee, which was very exciting. We were able to present on the city's top bonding priority, Upper Harbor Terminal. This was the first time that the committee had the opportunity to be briefed on the Upper Harbor Terminal redevelopment proposal. So it was about an hour long, and we had a lot of really great questions and dialogue between presenters as well as committee members. The House, because the city did present on Upper Harbor last session and it carries over into this session, we won't be at this time presenting again on any of our projects, actually, because they were all heard last session and they were included in the House's bonding tour last November.
We do have a question or comment from Vice Chair Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. And thank you, Ms. Nessie. Do you know what impact this community letter that went to Senator Sinjim will have on our bonding request?
I can't speak for the senator or the committee members that received the letter, but the author of the letter was there at the hearing yesterday and was given the opportunity to speak. It was kind of a hearing on our project as well as the opportunity for the public to speak on the project. They shared their concerns about the project. We had the opportunity to address them. We had about 32 members from the community and some city staff show up in support of the project, which was a really great turnout. So we continue to work with those who have stated their concerns in opposition to the project. I know our CPED staff is continuing to engage through the CPC process as well as doing one-on-one meetings to try to address the concerns that were raised in the letter as well as at the hearing yesterday.
Okay. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.
Yeah. So the House will be wrapping up the hearings on bonding bills and intends to produce a final bill estimated at the end of the month before the April 3rd break. But we're not totally sure on that release date yet. Bonding bills do need to originate out of the House. The Senate then kind of responds to what the House puts out. So let the negotiations begin. So. As far as a public safety update, House File 8 and House File 9 were passed off of the House floor on February 27th. Those House File 8 would require mandatory background checks, criminal background checks on gun purchases. The House File 9 is referred to as the red flag bill, which would allow people to petition courts to have firearms removed from the home of an individual if the court allowed it. Those are the same bills that were passed out of the House last year. And so As far as transit safety, that's been a hot topic at the legislature this year. In the House, there is a proposal to have Metro Transit implement a transit ambassador program, which would allow for non-uniformed individuals to ride the trains, ride the buses, and do fare checks, as well as connect folks with social services if needed. The bill also proposes to decriminalize fare evasions. Currently, they're a criminal offense while a misdemeanor, and they have a very high fee to them. The bill would then decriminalize it and make it more aligned with a parking ticket. So the city, it's in line with our criminal justice reform efforts to decriminalize activities and right-size the penalty. That just was heard by the Judiciary Committee yesterday. In the Senate, they're hearing a different version of a proposal to add more transit police. Today, that was heard in the Transportation Committee in the Senate, and there isn't consensus on the best way to move forward with either. The Met Council would like to implement the ambassador program and not add additional police in this respect, but there's a disagreement between the House and the Senate on which is the best way to move forward.
Council Vice Chair Jenkins.
Thank you, Chair Johnson. And this is not a question, but just a comment from my colleagues. I just met with the City Attorney's Office earlier this morning, and we are seeing a huge increase in our jail population, as well as Metro Transit Police on the trains, and people are being arrested for very low-level crimes like fare evasion, sleeping on trains, essentially criminalizing homelessness. And I really hope that this is not a trend that's going to continue. It sounds like the House bill is a little more humane. However, the Senate bill seems to double down on what's currently happening. So, FYI.
Thank you. All right.
Yep, we'll continue to monitor that and continue our engagement with Metro Transit. Around housing finance this year, the big issue is bonding around housing infrastructure bonds, as well as general obligation bonds, which can be used to rehab public housing. The city has added support for everything from the Homes for All agenda, which is seeking $500 million in housing infrastructure and general obligation bonds. We also support the Minnesota Housing Finance Agency's request for $200 million in housing infrastructure bonds and $60 million in general obligation bonds. Obviously, the more investment in housing we support. The city is also actively supporting a shelter bill that would provide one-time standalone dollars for shelters to apply through a competitive process through MHFA. Again, this would just be a one-time, one-year allocation. So, renter protections. On, I believe it was first week of March, the House heard 5 tenant protection bills, and they all made it through committee and will be scheduled to be heard in the House Judiciary Committee, and they ranged from pre-eviction notice and quite a few landlord-tenant provision modifications around noting that landlords setting a 24-hour rule for landlords to enter properties, setting the hours from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., new requirements around emergency repairs, minimum temperatures within units, and the last one would lift the affordability covenant for both state and local governments to allow more than 30 years of affordability requirements to projects that are receive public funding through those entities.
Great.
Happy to stand for any questions on those.
I don't see any questions.
All right, thank you.
Mr. Chairman, there's one thing I'd like to add. That's the the Builders Association has a whole bunch of bills. I think there's 17 of them out there. And one that was just recently introduced and there's been lots of newspaper articles on is dealing with zoning. The League of Cities, Metro Cities is opposed to that. We're working closely with them on that too. The bill could be heard probably in the Senate, but there is a author in the House, Representative Elkins, and it could get heard there too. So we're trying to find ways to work on that bill. And I know several members have contacted us on that bill, city council members and others and staff, and we're trying to get some arguments for and some information on that.
Council President Bender.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm glad you mentioned that, and it probably does, need some follow-up internally at our next, we have those meetings scheduled regularly as well. I think it's interesting from what I can tell from the proposal. The city might be open to some elements of the legislation, but maybe not other elements of it. And it's an interesting question that's happening around the country, which is what is the role of state government in looking at local laws? And on the one hand, I think most cities and most localities would say like that's in the purview of our local government and would be very reluctant to give that up. But on the other hand, we know how hard it is from firsthand experience to allow for more housing in our communities. And there are consequences beyond, city borders that are regional nature and a statewide nature. And so I'm actually encouraged that the legislature is thinking about this and is taking it up. Member of our delegation and I talked about this as well. It's just this general topic of expanding housing choice and looking at ways that the state can be a partner in that work. So I think it's an interesting debate. It's certainly part of a national trend of states looking at land use differently and seeing those consequences of local decisions adding up over time. I think we would probably want to ask for more support from our legislature on some other issues if they were going to take action on this one. But those things are moving too. And I think, maybe to be more specific about that, I think the states that have moved toward loosening up their housing markets and allowing more housing have done so in coordination with, being clear about things like inclusionary zoning, which I think our legislature could stand to improve our state laws around, enabling localities to do inclusionary zoning as we have. They've paired it with renter protections. They've actually paired it with rent increase caps, which we are starting to study. So they've not just done the market deregulation side, but they've paired it with a comprehensive approach to housing that's looking at protecting renters and the folks who are most vulnerable from displacement. So I think that would be our expectation as we are holding ourselves to that standard, that we would want to see, these things moving forward together, but lots to talk about.
Councilmember Wright.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yes, lots to talk about indeed. But I wasn't even going to broach this topic, but you opened the door, so thank you, Mr. Ranieri. Not to get into any detail now, but yeah, there's two ways to look at it on the main, from my perspective. One, and Council President alluded to it, is this just, raw market liberalization with no real policy objective at the end of the deal? It's clearly, I don't see the merit in that, though others might. And then there's a whole thing about concurrence with regional plans. To me, if it's about that, then we have a conversation. And I think there's a strong place where Minneapolis can have its role as a deciding factor in how a community grows, because we are consistent with the objectives of the Metro Plan. And I think what was being discussed earlier was this notion that people are out of sync with our agreements as a region. It's like, oh yeah, we agree with this as a region, but then when it gets time to actually do it and implement at the local level, oh, not so much. As a matter of fact, they codify the not so much. And I think that's a conversation very, very well worth having, as long as it goes down that path. But if you read the Strib article, this was just sort of a neoliberal, open up the market move that I don't think we would necessarily concur with.
Thank you. Councilmember Schrader.
Well, I can be brief because of my other colleagues. I think it was very well put by Councilmember Reich and the Council President. I think the one thing I would add to that is if our state representatives really want to help out on affordable housing and they're sincere about that, approve the bonding bill. That really comes down to that simple. It's very hard. I had to get that on their level, but if they want a real meaningful impact, the 500 would be fantastic.
Any additional discussion?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Ranieri?
in response to Councilmember Reich's comment, that bill only applies to the 7-county metropolitan area. So there's a framework there, but also your first option may also be involved in there too. We have to work on, but that bill may be heard in both bodies.
Any additional discussion? Well, not seeing any. Thank you so much for the updates. We really appreciate them. Lots of things going on. Very active as usual. I'll go ahead and move that we receive and file those updates. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Those opposed, the motion carries. With no further business before us, this meeting is adjourned.